Time stops here, literally, and if you stay too long, you disappear. You've heard the stories, I'm sure. Everyone who passes through Blackwood Canyon, but they talk about the old motel, the one nestled deep in the mountains, where the clocks are always stuck at 3 o'clock. They whisper about the guests who checked in, but never checked out. People like me, though, we don't believe in ghosts or tall tales. We believe in what we see, and what I saw was a job posting, a guard position at the Last Stop Motel, a place so isolated it felt like the edge of the world, tucked away in the American West. The ad promised a good wage, far from the city, and that was all the motivation I needed. A fresh start after everything. I had a past I was running from, a kind of ghost of my own, a debt I owed to myself and to a memory. I didn't know then that the real debt would be my sanity. I didn't know that the disappearances weren't just stories. They were a pattern, a ritual, a real-life criminal investigation that was about to turn into something far, far worse. Subscribe and hit the bell to see what happens next. And tell me, at what time are you watching this? And from which city? The old Ford pickup groaned up the final hairpin turn, its headlights cutting through the thick mountain fog. I could smell the pine needles and something else, something damp and earthy, like freshly disturbed ground. The air was cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Last Stop Motel sat like a forgotten relic, its neon sign flickering a lonely broken promise. A single peeling door with the number 7 was the only thing that seemed to be in working order. A silent sentinel in the dim light. I pulled into the small gravel lot, the tires crunching loudly. My new boss, a man named Marcus, was waiting outside the main office. He was a mountain of a man, with a beard full of gray, and eyes that looked like he'd seen too many sunrises. "You're early," he grunted, the words puffing out as steam in the cold air. The sound of a bell from a nearby church clock echoed eerily, even though the clock itself was not visible. I was here. This was my new beginning. Marcus didn't waste any time. He handed me a ring of heavy keys and a flashlight. Check the perimeter every hour. Look for anything out of place. The canyon gets lonely, and sometimes people wander off the main road. He didn't mention the disappearances, not at first. My first round was uneventful. I walked the narrow paths between the cabins, my boots crunching on the gravel. I checked the locked pool house, its windows streaked with grime, the water inside a murky, uninviting green. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. I found a single weathered doll lying on the ground near cabin 9. Its plastic face faded and cracked. It felt out of place, an unsettling splash of color in the drab environment. I picked it up, intending to throw it away, but something about its empty stare gave me pause. I put it in my pocket instead, a strange souvenir from my first night. As I passed the main office again, I heard a low humming sound coming from inside. It was a kind of rhythmic clicking, like an old clock ticking, but it was too fast, too irregular. I dismissed it as old machinery. The wind in the trees sounded like a whisper. My patrol continued. I noticed a small, unmarked shed behind the last row of cabins. It wasn't on the map. Marcus had given me a rusty padlock hung from the door, a thick chain wrapped around it. The padlock was old, but the chain was new. I tried the keys Marcus had given me, but none of them fit. A faint scratching sound came from within the shed, like something small and desperate trying to get out. My flashlight beam cut through the grime on the window. Inside, there was a single, old-fashioned clock on a small table. Its pendulum swung back and forth frantically, its hands spinning backward at an impossible speed. The clock wasn't ticking, it was humming, and the sound was coming from that very machine. And as I stared at it, the hands of the clock, already spinning, suddenly stopped, frozen at the same time as every other clock in the canyon. 3 o'clock. A sudden, sharp gust of wind blew through the trees, and the humming stopped. The scratching from inside the shed, however, did not. The next morning, the air was still and bright. I told Marcus about the shed, but he just shrugged. The canyon has its own rules, he said, and the subject was closed. He didn't seem surprised or concerned. The doll from the night before felt heavy in my pocket. I decided to keep it, a token of my first brush with the strangeness of this place. I had a feeling the canyon itself wanted me to find it, a morbid welcome gift. That day, I found a stack of old newspapers in the office, brittle with age, and a new kind of curiosity began to bloom. I spent my daylight hours doing odd jobs, fixing a leaky faucet in cabin 4 and clearing a path behind the main office. Marcus was out for the day, leaving me alone with the quiet and the ghosts of the past. I went through every single newspaper, my fingers turning the fragile pages carefully. The pattern was undeniable. A disappearance every few years, always in the same area. A missing person with no trace, no body, just a quiet, sudden vanishing. One article mentioned a local police officer, a Sergeant Miller, who had worked on the first disappearance. Another spoke of a secret society of locals who believed the disappearances were a kind of curse on the land. Marcus's dismissal of the shed and the odd clock started to make more sense. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a local legend, the kind of thing that gets passed down in whispers and bar conversations. I pulled out my phone and tried to look up Sergeant Miller, but my signal was too weak. Transition. My sleep that night was fitful. I dreamt of spinning clock hands and empty, smiling dolls. The lines between the real crimes and the local legends were beginning to blur. I was no longer a simple security guard. I was a detective, and this was my first cold case. The next day, I found Marcus in the small, dusty bar. He ran out of the main office. The bar was rarely open, but tonight he was polishing a glass. The low hum of an old refrigerator, the only sound, the smell of stale beer and old wood filled the air. I sat at a wobbly stool and ordered a soda. Marcus stopped polishing the glass. His eyes, which had been distant, suddenly focused on me. "Silas, why do you ask?" he said, his voice flat. I told him about the newspaper clipping and the photo. He slowly put the glass down. He was a quiet man, Marcus said, his voice low. Came here when he was just a kid. He was the groundskeeper for years. They called him the Canyon's keeper because he knew this place better than anyone. He believed the canyon was a living thing, that it had a soul. He said it was hungry. He paused, his hand still on the bar. He used to tell me that the canyon took what it wanted, the people just vanished, and he'd be the one to find the remnants. He told me that Silas had a small shed where he kept all his tools and odd things he found in the canyon. He mentioned a journal Silas kept, a kind of personal log of the canyon's moods and appetites. Marcus didn't know what happened to the journal, or to Silas's body, for that matter. The official report said he had passed away in his sleep, but the body was never recovered. He just disappeared, the same way everyone else did. Just as I was about to ask another question, the old refrigerator hummed to a stop, plunging the room into a deep, unsettling silence. A faint, whispering sound came from the corner of the bar, near the jukebox. It sounded like a child's voice, muffled and indistinct. It was the same sound I had heard coming from the shed On my first night, Marcus looked at me, his eyes wide with a fear I hadn't seen before. The whisper grew louder, a chilling, repetitive phrase. Find him, find him. He's lost. The voice was coming from the jukebox, but it wasn't on. The silence returned as suddenly as it had left. Marcus looked at me, his face pale. The jukebox hasn't worked in 10 years, he said, his voice shaking. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into a story that was still being written. The cold cases, the legends, the unexplainable voice. It was all a tapestry, and I was just now starting to pull on the threads. My search for answers led me to the shed again. I had to know what was in there. The padlock was still on the door, but the chain looked different, newer somehow. The air was thick with the same earthy smell I had noticed on my first night. I pulled out my set of keys, the ones Marcus had given me. I tried them all, one by one, but none of them fit. I cursed under my breath, my frustration growing. As I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught a loose stone near the foundation. I nudged it with my boot. Underneath, a small, rusted key lay half buried in the dirt. It fit the padlock. I had my way in. Inside, the shed was a mess of rusty tools and old jars, but in the center, on a small table, sat the humming clock, now silent. Beside it was a small, leather-bound book, Silas's journal. I picked it up, the leather worn and cool to the touch. The first page was dated the day after the first disappearance, the one with the hiker. The journal wasn't just a record of the canyon's moods, it was a confession. Silas wrote about the entity, a presence in the canyon he called the Lost Wanderer. He wrote about the disappearances, not as tragedies, but as offerings. He believed the entity was an ancient force that fed on lost souls and memories. He wrote about a ritual, a kind of pact he had made with the entity. He would bring it offerings in exchange for the canyon's protection, the hikers, the families, the people who vanished. He was the one who led them to their end. He wrote about the clock, a cursed artifact he had found, a ticking heart that anchored the entity to the canyon. The journal was a true crime story, told from the perpetrator's point of view. It was a twisted, horrifying record of a man's descent into madness. He wrote about the doll, a gift he gave to his last victim, a small boy, to make the transition easier. My hand went to my pocket, where the cracked doll lay heavy. The doll, the one in the old photo, the one I had found. It was a link, a silent testament to the horrors that had happened here. I was so engrossed in the journal that I didn't hear the door close. I looked up. Marcus was standing in the doorway, his face pale and grim. "You shouldn't have opened that," he said, his voice low and full of a cold, quiet dread. He held a rusty, old hunting rifle in his hands. "He told me to keep the canyon fed," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "He told me I was the next keeper." The scratching sound from the wall started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the leather-bound journal in my hands. The pages were trembling, and I could hear a faint, distant whisper coming from within its worn pages. The voice was no longer a child's. It was a chorus of voices, all whispering the same word, keeper. The world around me began to spin. The scent of pine needles and damp earth was replaced by a metallic, coppery smell. The whisper of 1,000 voices was now a scream. The lines between the real and the unreal had finally dissolved. Marcus stood there, the rifle, a heavy presence in the small, cluttered shed. His eyes were wide with a kind of resigned horror. He looked like a man trapped, a prisoner of a legacy he never asked for. He didn't want to hurt me. But something else was compelling him. "It's the pact," he stammered, his voice choked with fear. "He made me promise. He said if the canyon isn't fed, it will take everything." He gestured to the humming clock, now silent. "That thing, it's a tether. It keeps it here. It's the source of the disappearances." I had to think fast. I couldn't fight him, not with a rifle. "What about Sergeant Miller?" I asked, a desperate ploy to buy some time. "The one from the newspapers." Marcus's eyes went vacant for a moment. He tried to stop it. Marcus whispered, his voice almost inaudible. "He came here. He read the journal. He found Silas's notes. He tried to destroy the clock. But the canyon took him." Marcus looked at the clock, a kind of reverence in his eyes. He became a part of it, a piece of its hunger. He told me that Sergeant Miller had created a protocol, a kind of secret file, an official record of the paranormal events, a last-ditch effort to warn people. He said he had hidden it somewhere in the motel, a last hope. The conversation itself was a clue, a kind of breadcrumb trail left by a man who knew he was about to disappear. A sharp, metallic click echoed in the room. I realized Marcus had just made a choice. The humming from the clock started again, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The voices from the journal were a roar now, a deafening chorus. "Keeper," they screamed. "Keeper." Marcus raised the rifle, his eyes not on me, but on something behind me. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then he made his move. The rifle fired. The impact on the ancient metal was a sickening thud, and the clock shattered into a million pieces. The humming stopped. The voices stopped. I was alone in the shed, with the shattered remains of a clock and the heavy silence of 1,000 lost souls. The pact was broken, but I had a feeling the story was far from over. I left the shed, the cold mountain air, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the room. My mind was reeling. I was now alone at the last stop motel, a place where a curse had just been broken, but a new kind of threat was just beginning. My search led me to an old metal filing cabinet in the back corner of the office. The drawers were locked. I tried my keys, but none of them fit. I looked at my keyring. It was only then that I noticed the small, tarnished medallion on the chain. It was a simple silver disc with the letters JM. I turned the medallion over in my hand, and a small, almost invisible switch popped out. I pressed it, and a tiny, intricate key slid out from a hidden compartment. The key fit the filing cabinet's lock. Inside, I found a thick file, its cover a faded orange. The title, scrawled in a shaky hand, read, Project Canyon Protocol, File 1. The file contained Sergeant Miller's notes, his own investigation into the disappearances. He had spoken to the locals. He had read Silas's journal, and he had confirmed my worst fears. The disappearances were a ritual, and the key to the protocol was a direct link to my own family's past. As I read through the file, a small, worn photograph fell out. It was a picture of a young ranger, a man who looked exactly like my grandfather, standing next to a smiling young boy. The boy was holding the same doll. My grandfather's face was full of the same hope I had seen in the newspaper clipping. The text on the back was faded, but I could make out 2 words. First victim. I was looking at a picture of my own grandfather, standing next to the first victim of the canyon's curse, and he was holding the very doll I had in my pocket. The doll was a key, a kind of anchor. My grandfather was not a park ranger. He was a keeper. My world was spinning again. The past and present were no longer separate. They were one long, endless line of disappearances, and I was standing right at the end of it. I held the protocol in my hands, a tangible link to a story that had been passed down through generations, through my own bloodline. The knowledge was a heavy weight, a kind of sickness in my stomach. The air in the office grew icy, a cold that seeped deeper than skin. The protocol was a series of journals, notes, and a single audio recording. I found a small portable cassette player in a drawer. Nearby, a pack of old batteries lay forgotten. I popped them in and pushed the play button. The tape hissed for a moment, and then a familiar voice filled the air. It was Sergeant Miller, his voice thick with fear and a kind of desperate resignation. He spoke about his investigation, about his discovery of the ritual, about the keeper. He talked about how the canyon was a kind of a living thing, a predator that fed on the lost. They would feed the canyon in exchange for its protection. The disappearances were not random, they were carefully chosen. My grandfather had been one of them. He was a keeper, and he had chosen the first victim, the boy in the photograph. The protocol was a kind of final warning, a last plea. "Break the pact," Miller said on the tape, his voice trembling. "Break the pact before it breaks you." He didn't mention what would happen if the pact was broken. He was a cop. He believed in evidence and facts. He just didn't have enough of them to understand the consequences of his own actions. I was no longer just a guard at a motel. I was a man standing face to face with the monster that had haunted my family for generations. And I had a feeling my past was about to catch up with me in the worst possible way. The creature moved with a kind of jerky, unsettling grace. It was a patchwork of lost souls, a grotesque tapestry of everyone who had vanished. I could see the faint outline of a child's face, the terrified eyes of a hiker, the vacant stare of a family man. They were all a part of it, a collective scream. In a silent body, the air grew thick and heavy, a palpable presence of 1,000 memories. My heart hammered against my ribs, my flashlight beam danced on the creature's misshapen form, and I could hear the faint guttural sound it made, a kind of hungry hum. I backed away slowly, my hand instinctively going for my pocket. I felt the cold, hard plastic of the doll. It was my last link, my final piece of evidence. I had to use it. I held it out, in front of me, like a shield, a kind of twisted talisman. "I know about you," I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. "I know about Silas. I know about the keepers. I know what you want." The creature stopped, its head, a kind of amorphous blob of despair, tilted to the side. The collective whispers of the lost grew louder, a wave of incoherent noise. I could feel the truth coursing through me, the truth of the pact, the truth of the curse. I could feel the moral dilemma in my gut. I had the choice to run, to let the cycle continue, or to face it head on. I chose to fight. I chose to break the curse, once and for all. I threw the doll at the creature. It landed on the floor with a dull thud. The creature looked at the doll, its black eyes focusing on the faded, cracked face. A kind of shudder ran through its body, a ripple of 1,000 memories. The creature's form began to warp and twist, the outlines of the lost souls becoming more defined, more agitated. I could hear their screams now, a symphony of pure, unadulterated pain. The creature began to unravel, its body disintegrating into 1,000 wisps of smoke and light. It wasn't an attack, it was a release. The souls of the lost were finally free. But as the last wisp of smoke disappeared, I felt a new kind of pain, a kind of emptiness in my head. A piece of me was gone. My own memory, the one I had been running from, had been the price. The sun was just beginning to rise over the canyon, painting the world in a warm, gentle light. The cold, earthy smell was gone. The quiet hum of the old refrigerator was back. Everything was back to normal, except me. I'm sitting here now, in the main office, writing this down. I don't know who I am. I don't know why I came here. All I know is that the Last Stop Motel is a place where a lot of people disappeared, and a man named Marcus was gone forever after trying to break a curse. The curse is gone, and so is the lost wanderer, but the cost was high. My own memories are gone. The debt I had been running from is paid in full, but I have no idea what it was. I have a feeling that the other keepers, the ones before me, also paid the same price. They found a way to break the curse, but they lost a part of themselves in the process. The canyon is finally at peace, but I am not. I found my grandfather's medallion on the floor, lying next to the shattered pieces of the clock. I picked it up. It felt different now, no longer a useless trinket, but a heavy, meaningful weight, a reminder of a past I no longer have. I looked at the faded photograph of him and the boy, a new kind of understanding in my heart. He had made the same choice. He had given up his memories to save the canyon, to stop the cycle of disappearances. He had saved us all, but at the cost of his own past. He had become a hero, but a forgotten one, just like me. I am a nameless guard at a forgotten motel, a hero without a past, a ghost without a memory. The curse is gone, but the canyon still has its secrets. I have a feeling that the story is not over. The lost wanderer may be gone, but the canyon is still a living, breathing thing. It will find a new way to feed, and a new keeper will be chosen. I don't know who they will be, but I have a feeling they will have to make the same choice I did. The choice between their memories and their survival. The last thing I heard on the tape was a kind of faint, echoing voice. It sounded like Sergeant Miller. The canyon remembers. It said, it always remembers. Share it, drop your thoughts, subscribe, and hit the bell. What would you do if you had to pay with your memories to save a life?